On May the 26th, 2015, schoolboy James Fairweather lay in white. The serial killer obsessed 15-year-old hid in these bushes in this park in Colchester, Essex. His plan? To kill for a third time. But just as he was about to strike again, the teenager was derailed. A dog walker spotted Fairweather and recognized his distinctive jacket. From the police appeals, he was arrested and eventually convicted of 2 murders. James Fairweather is one of the youngest convicted serial killers in the UK, responsible for the brutal murders of 2 strangers in Colchester, Essex, in 2014. At just 15 years old, he carried out unprovoked stabbings that shocked the nation due to their extreme violence. His case raises complex questions about teenage psychopathy, mental health, and the factors that drive young people toward violent crime may have affected this child.
People with autism find it difficult to know what you're thinking, but unlike a psychopathic adult, they care what you're feeling, so there's a real difference there, right? And most people with any kind of neurodevelopmental problem or mental health problem much more likely to be a victim than to be an aggressor or somebody who's perpetrating a crime.
James Fairweather was born in 1999 and grew up in Colchester, Essex. He was raised in what appeared to be a normal working-class household. There are no widely reported indications that he suffered from extreme abuse or neglect in his home. However, as he entered his teenage years, his behavior became increasingly troubling. At school, Fairweather was known as a quiet and withdrawn boy, but classmates later recalled his fascination with violent crime and serial killers. He often spoke about famous murderers like the Yorkshire Ripper Peter Sutcliffe and the Moors murderers Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. He even expressed admiration for them, discussing their crimes in detail. Teachers and peers noticed Fairweather's growing detachment from reality. He had a history of being bullied, which may have contributed to his social withdrawal. Some reports suggest he suffered from learning difficulties and struggled with aggression. I've worked with my fair share of trouble, teenagers over the years, but I've never come across one as unhinged as James Fairweather. What caused this 15-year-old boy to kill 2 strangers? Was it down to his environment? Was he born a ticking time bomb?
Normally when you get a child that has an interaction with the criminal justice system, it scares them and informs them that that was a horrible experience. But if anything, that kind of makes them, and oh, I can't enjoy that feeling of harming someone else. So his is gradually escalating. There's no sense of consequence or I need to change as I need to actually get worse.
Is it psychopathy or just lack of behavioral control? James Fairweather was arrested without charge and suspended from his school. But he didn't learn his lesson. Just 2 months later, he was ready to commit his first murder. On a quiet night in March 2014, the historic market town of Colchester, Essex, was rocked by an act of violence so savage and inexplicable that it left an entire community stunned and fearful. The murder of James Atfield would later be recognized as the chilling debut of one of the UK's youngest serial killers. But even before the second victim fell, the brutality of Atfield's death had already made headlines and haunted detectives. This case was not just about the life lost, but about the cracks in society, the missed signs, and the sinister mind of a young killer hiding in plain sight. 33-year-old James Atfield, who was vulnerable due to a previous traumatic brain injury, was stabbed more than 100 times in a frenzied attack carried out by a person no one could have predicted: a 15-year-old boy named James Fairweather. Before delving into the circumstances of his death, it is important to understand who James Atfield was in life. Known to friends and family as Jim, Atfield was a gentle, kind-hearted man who had suffered significant hardship. In 2010, James Atfield was hit by a car in a road traffic accident that left him with a severe brain injury. He spent weeks in the hospital, undergoing surgeries and rehabilitation. The effects of the accident were lasting. Atfield lost some cognitive functions, developed physical coordination issues, and was categorized as a vulnerable adult. His family and support workers described him as someone who was adjusting to his new reality with grace, despite the immense challenges. It was a Saturday evening when James was last seen alive. He had reportedly been drinking earlier in the day but was not considered heavily intoxicated. As night fell, he made his way toward Castle Park, a tranquil spot bordered by trees, benches, and a riverbank, a place he often found peace. At approximately 5:45 a.m. on March 30th, a dog walker discovered Atfield lying in the grass near the park's edge, barely alive and covered in blood. Emergency services rushed to the scene, but it was too late. He died from catastrophic injuries shortly after being found. Unknown to the public and law enforcement at the time, the killer was a local teenage boy, James Fairweather, only 15 years old. Fairweather had returned to the scene multiple times after the murder, reliving the moment. He would later confess to feeling a rush of power and satisfaction from the act. After realizing he hadn't been caught, he began fantasizing about killing again. The thrill of the kill had ignited something dark within him. Investigators pored over the physical evidence. James Atfield's clothing was analyzed for DNA or fibers, but results were inconclusive. The nature of the wounds led some experts to suggest that the killer may have had a deep fascination with anatomy or pathology, given the deliberate targeting of vital areas. Blood patterns confirmed he was attacked while sitting or lying on the ground, then rolled over multiple times. Nearby tree branches had marks, suggesting a struggle and potentially the movement of the weapon. But at the time, Fairweather remained completely off the radar. There were no witnesses to link him to the crime, and he had no criminal record of violence. His age, demeanor, and the sheer randomness of the attack shielded him from suspicion. Despite this extensive work, the evidence wasn't enough to identify the perpetrator. Fairweather's name didn't come up in any of the investigations until a full year later, and only after he was caught attempting to stalk a third victim. James Fairweather would later claim that he heard voices urging him to kill. Is it possible that something beyond his control would possess this 15-year-old boy to become a murderer? On a summer morning in 2014, 31-year-old Nahid Almania walked down a familiar path in the peaceful town of Colchester, England. But as she neared her destination, she was unknowingly being watched and stalked by a predator with an insatiable desire to kill. Fairweather was about to kill again. This was less than 3 months later after the murder of James Atfield. Almania was a student of the University of Colchester, Essex. She was walking along a quiet footpath in Colchester when Fairweather ambushed her. Almania was stabbed 16 times, including deep wounds to her neck and torso. Her injuries suggested a targeted, brutal assault with a knife. She was wearing a hijab and abaya, initially leading investigators suspected a hate crime. Unlike Atfield, Almania had no known vulnerabilities. She was simply at the wrong place at the wrong time, chosen randomly by Fairweather. Nahid Almania was an intelligent and ambitious woman. Originally from Saudi Arabia, she moved to the UK to pursue her dreams of higher education to be a PhD student at the University of Essex. She was passionate about learning and dedicated to her studies in linguistics. But for Nahid, education was more than just academics. It was a gateway to opportunity, to independence, to a future she had worked tirelessly to build. Every morning, Nahid walked the same route from her student accommodation to campus. June 17, 2014, was no different. As she left her home that morning, she had no idea that her routine walk would be her last. At approximately 10:40 a.m., Nahid walked along the Salary Brook Trail, a secluded footpath frequently used by students and locals. But this morning, she wasn't alone. Behind her, a 15-year-old boy, James Fairweather, was watching, waiting. In his hand, a knife. In his mind, an uncontrollable urge to kill again. Fairweather struck fast, stabbing Nahid repeatedly in a frenzied assault. The knife sliced through her chest, neck, and arms as she tried desperately to fight him off. 16 wounds in total. By the time paramedics arrived, there was nothing they could do. She was gone. As news of the murder spread, fear gripped the town. Who could commit such a heinous act in broad daylight? And why? Investigators scrambled for answers, and soon, speculation turned into national controversy. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, her attacker vanished into the trees. It wasn't long before a passerby made a horrifying discovery: Nahid's body, lying lifeless on the ground. Blood pooled around her as her abaya, the traditional cloak she wore, lay torn and stained. One of the first theories to emerge was that Nahid had been targeted for her religion and ethnicity. She was a Muslim woman wearing a hijab, an easy and visible target for an Islamophobic attack. At the time, anti-Muslim hate crimes were rising across the UK. Nahid's murder fit a pattern seen in other parts of the country, fueling speculation that this was a hate-driven killing. Outrage erupted. Muslim communities feared for their safety. Had a far-right extremist committed this crime? Or was there a lone racist killer lurking in Colchester? As police intensified their investigation, a chilling realization surfaced, and Nahid's murder bore eerie similarities to another violent killing that had taken place just 3 months earlier. 33-year-old James Atfield had been found dead in Colchester's Castle Park in March 2014. He had been stabbed an astonishing 102 times in an act of unimaginable brutality. Despite extensive investigations, police had been unable to find his killer. Now, 2 murders, both seemingly random, both incredibly violent, had occurred in the same town, just miles apart. Were they connected? Was Colchester in the grip of a serial killer?
Surprise me if he'd been sneaking out of his bedroom at night and hanging around in those areas. He wanted to really get familiar with his hunting ground and not leave anything to chance. But I think what he wants to do is become kind of officially a serial killer, reach a particular number, so he's being careful. He's trying to put these safeguards in place, but he's enjoying the thrill of it.
On May the 26th, 2015, James Fairweather was ready to kill for the 3rd time. He headed back to Salary Brook Trail, where he had murdered Nahid less than a year before, and patiently waited for another victim. For over a year, the brutal murders of Nahid Almania and James Atfield remained unsolved. Investigators had exhausted leads, and fear had gripped the community. The idea of a violent killer roaming free, striking at random, was enough to send chills through the town of Colchester. But no one expected the break in the case to come from something so mundane: an observant police officer on routine patrol. On May 26, 2015, a local police officer was patrolling the Greenstead area of Colchester, a neighborhood near where Nahid Almania had been killed almost a year earlier. As he drove by a footpath leading into a wooded area, he noticed something strange. A young man stood among the trees, shifting uneasily, watching the path. The officer slowed down. The figure is wearing a hooded jacket, standing still, partially obscured by the foliage. The boy looked out of place, his posture tense, his behavior suspicious. And then, something chilling, the officer noticed he was wearing gloves. In May, on a warm day, something wasn't right. As the officer got closer, the young man spotted him. He hesitated for a moment, then turned as if to walk away. But it was too late. The officer called out, stopping him in his tracks. The officer asked what he was doing there. The teenager mumbled a response, something about just walking. But the officer wasn't convinced. The boy was nervous, sweating despite the cool air, his body language screaming unease. And then the officer spotted it, a long knife, partially concealed in his clothing. The officer immediately calls for backup, reaching for his radio and saying, "I need units here immediately." Possible armed suspect. The teenager was arrested on the spot and taken to the police station for questioning. At first, he said little, but as the hours passed, his disturbing secret unraveled. The boy's name was James Fairweather, and as detectives questioned him, what began as a routine stop transformed into a horrifying revelation. Fairweather was not just a troubled teenager wandering in the woods. He was something far worse. A serial killer in the making. When detectives pressed him about his presence near the footpath, Fairweather made a chilling admission. Fairweather said, "I was waiting for my next victim." The confession was shocking, but it didn't stop there. As detectives continued to probe, Fairweather spoke about the voices in his head he claimed that ordered him to kill. Then, in a flat, emotionless voice, He described exactly how he had killed both Nahid Almania and James Atfield. Details only the killer could have known.
Yes. Went up to him. Stood over like that. Helping that. So I stabbed him first there. And I've done it a few times. While I was doing that, my voices were laughing and laughing.
James Fairweather showed a complete lack of remorse. For his victims, his cold demeanor divided opinion. Did he not care, or was he incapable of caring? James Fairweather wasn't just a teenager with a troubled mind. He was a predator in the making, a boy who idolized killers, sought out suffering, and reveled in brutality. His crimes weren't impulsive. They were calculated, chilling, deliberate. Psychologists believe Fairweather exhibited key traits of antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, including a lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, and a disturbing fascination with violence. He showed no remorse for his actions, only frustration that he had been caught. His excessive violence, the sheer savagery of his attacks, wasn't just about killing. It was about control, dominance, the thrill of power over life and death. He later blamed his crimes on voices in his head, an attempt to paint himself as a victim of mental illness. But experts dismissed this claim, calling it a calculated lie. There were no signs of schizophrenia, no genuine psychosis, just a cold, remorseless killer who wanted to be remembered like the murderers he admired. He wasn't a victim of his mind. He was a student of horror, someone who wanted to make his mark through death. But instead of infamy, he got a prison cell. Instead of becoming a legend, he became a cautionary tale. Sentenced to life behind bars, with a minimum of 27 years, James Fairweather will spend his prime years in the very isolation he once inflicted on his victims. But for the families of James Atfield and Nahid Almania, no sentence can bring back what was lost. Their loved ones were taken in moments of unimaginable cruelty, victims of a boy who had no regard for life. James Fairweather could have been just another teenager, but he chose a path of violence. And in doing so, he sealed his fate forever, known not as a feared killer, but as a failed monster whose own darkness consumed him. To truly understand James Fairweather, we must turn to the expert psychologists and forensic analysts who studied his case closely. What they found was deeply unsettling. One of the most chilling aspects of his psychological profile was his detachment from reality, not in the sense of psychosis, but in his complete lack of concern for human life. Experts noted that he spoke about his crimes with cold indifference, as if he were narrating a story rather than recalling real events. His claim of hearing voices was almost certainly fabricated. There was no clinical evidence of schizophrenia or auditory hallucinations. Instead, what we saw was a manipulative young offender trying to evade responsibility by imitating infamous serial killers who had used similar insanity defenses in the past. Experts also noted that Fairweather showed a dangerous level of cognitive distortion, his belief that he was special, destined for infamy. He wanted to be feared. He wanted to be remembered. But what he failed to understand was that true infamy isn't chosen, it's imposed by history, and rarely in the way criminals hope for. James Fairweather wasn't just an angry teen. He displayed clear signs of callous, unemotional traits, meaning he lacked empathy, had no remorse, and was highly manipulative. His obsession with serial killers suggests a psychological condition known as Machiavellianism, a trait where individuals seek control and power through calculated cruelty. James Fairweather sought to become a legend. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even in the mind of a child, darkness can take root, and without intervention, it can consume everything in its path. Fairweather was just 15. Others, even younger. What leads a child to kill? Is it nature or nurture? Psychological disorders or personal choices? The answer is never simple. But one thing is clear: unchecked violence, isolation, and obsession can turn any mind, young or old, into something dangerous. True crime often forces us to confront the darkest corners of human nature. But when the perpetrators are children, the horror deepens. Society expects innocence in youth, yet cases like James Fairweather remind us that evil knows no age. Some child killers are rehabilitated, others remain a danger for life. But their victims like James Atfield and Nahid Almania never get a second chance. And that's the real tragedy of true crime. Behind every headline, every courtroom drama, there are real people, mothers, fathers, siblings left to pick up the pieces. Lives ended, futures stolen, all because of one person's dark desires.